or we can finish what we started last week, but I'm going to be very honest with you. I am not pushing so hard as to make sure that we finish, because I feel like last week we skipped over some good things. So go ahead and open your Bible in Hebrews chapter 9. I'm going to go over a couple of things that I feel like we left off maybe last week to kind of bring us back on the same page, and hopefully we can finish it this week. And just so you know, I guess in my own defense, as I have looked at several different commentaries in preparation for this passage, I realized that most of them divide this chapter into at least 3 different portions. So if we can finish it in 2 weeks, that's going to be way more than what most people do. And if we don't, then I'm just going to be average, right? So just so you know, as far as that is concerned. Hebrews chapter 9. Let's go ahead and read from Hebrews chapter 9. I know it's a long chapter, but stay with me. Let's go ahead and remind ourselves of what it's about. Now, even the first covenant had regulations of divine worship in the earthly sanctuary, for there was a tabernacle prepared. The outer one, in which there were the lampstand and the table and the sacred bread, this is called the holy place. Behind the second veil, there was a tabernacle, which is called the Holy of Holies, having a golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant, covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden jar holding the manna, and Aaron's rod which budded, and the tables of the covenant. And above it were the cherubim of glory, overshadowing the mercy seat. But of these things we cannot now speak in detail. Now, when these things have been so prepared, the priests are continually entering the outer tabernacle, performing the divine worship. But into the second, only the high priest enters once a year, not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. The Holy Spirit is signifying this, that the way into the holy place has not yet been disclosed while the outer tabernacle is still standing, which is a symbol for the present time. Accordingly, both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make the worshiper perfect in conscience, since they relate only to food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until a time of reformation. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things to come, he entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation, and not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood. He entered the holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling those who have been defiled, sanctified for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. For this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where a covenant is, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. For a covenant is valid only when men are dead, for it is never enforced while the one who made it lives. Therefore, even the first covenant was not inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people, according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water and scarlet, wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you." And in the same way, he sprinkled both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry with the blood. And according to the law, one may almost say all things are cleansed with blood, and without shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. Therefore, it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. Nor was it that he would offer himself often as the high priest enters the holy place year by year with blood that is not his own. Otherwise, he would have needed to suffer often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the consummation of the ages, he has been manifested to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And inasmuch as it is appointed for man to die once, and after this comes judgment, so Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation, without reference to sin, to those who eagerly await him. I mentioned last week how there is no other chapter in the Bible, in all of my years of study of the Bible, that could be described as sort of an encapsulation of the entire message of the Bible than Hebrews 9. And it's really, really interesting. As we started looking at it last week, we decided that the first 10 chapters, the first 10 verses of this chapter, verses 1 through 10 in Hebrews 9, are sort of your message of the Old Testament in a nutshell, right? The essence of worship under the first covenant. And a couple of things that we looked at here, just to kind of bring you up to speed and remind you what we looked at. There are, I don't know if you knew this, but what the author encapsulates here in about 10 verses, there are lots of chapters dedicated to the Old Testament. I don't know if you knew this, but there are 50 chapters at least that are dedicated across different books of the Old Testament to how the worship in the tabernacle was to be set up. And the fact that there are that many chapters dedicated to the worship in the tabernacle meant that God, whose holiness is so far above ours, wanted the humans to understand a very specific way in which they were to approach him. And really, I think if you want to know the truth, kind of the gist, I think maybe the main idea, the biggest thought that runs through this whole chapter, the biggest problem that this chapter identifies and resolves, really, and we talked about it even last week, is this whole idea of access to God. Access to God. And one thing that we see in the first 10 verses that the author repeats over and over and over again, the big idea with the access to God in the Old Testament was that it was very limited. The access to God in the Old Testament was very limited. You know, it's funny because I talked last week a little bit about the whole concept of worship. Because in our minds and in our day and age, when we think of worship, we think of a bunch of people, standing in church with their hands raised, and there's nothing wrong with that concept, only as long as we understand that that's not what worship looked like in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, worship that was described in the tabernacle included sacrificing. And it wasn't done by the entire congregation. The worship that involved sacrificing was only done by the people from one tribe, and that's the tribe of Levi. And even that worship that was done by the tribe of Levi, even within that tribe, there was even a greater limitation, if you will, a greater restriction as to who gets to actually enter in God's presence. That's beyond the holy place into the Holy of Holies. And who was it that had access to the Holy of Holies? Only one person, the high priest. And I want to tell you something interesting. And by the way, if you want to write yourself a little note on the side of your outlines, write down Leviticus chapter 16. That would be an interesting chapter for you to just look through, because that is the chapter that goes through the entire ceremony of the Day of Atonement. That's one day out of a year when the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies. So you could look in Leviticus 16 and read through the whole ceremony that was a part of it. But I want to tell you something interesting. You know how we talked about the fact that access to God was very restricted and very limited in the Old Testament? Even the whole approach with which, as you go home and you look at Leviticus 16, you're going to find out, even the whole approach with which the high priest would enter Holy of Holies was so different from our current new covenant way of worship. You see, we are called, we're invited, we are able to enter God's presence any time of day or night, and we enter God's presence with joy in our hearts and with praise and with raised hands and with peace in our minds, knowing that we're good, we have access to God. Jesus Christ secured that access. But you know the way that the high priest entered the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement? First of all, I want to tell you this. The Day of Atonement was not a joyous celebration. It was a very solemn occasion in Israel's worship. And the second thing that I want to tell you, as you go home and read Leviticus 16, I want you to have this mental image in your mind, because as the congregation gathered around the tabernacle in the desert, remember, only the priest from the Levite tribe could go into the holy place, and only, obviously, the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, but the rest of the congregation could stand on the outer court, or they can be around. But as the congregation gathered around the tabernacle on the Day of Atonement, and the high priest, by the way, some say that he was preparing himself for about 7 days prior to that day to make sure that there was nothing wrong, there was nothing defiled about him, there was nothing unclean about him. But as the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, first of all, he went in there twice. The first time he would present a bull offering for his own sins. And he would take the blood from the bull offering into the Holy of Holies. He would sprinkle the mercy seat of the ark there in the Holy of Holies. And then he would come out. And then he would present a goat offering for the sins of all of the people of Israel. And he would take the blood from that offering and he would go in and he would sprinkle that. But I want to tell you what the rest of the people did. As the high priest performed all these functions, he changed his clothing from his normal, very very beautiful robes into the robes of white linen, that signified holiness and purity, to go into the Holy of Holies. I want to tell you what the congregation did. As they gathered around the tabernacle, you could almost hear the pin drop. They almost held their breath, waiting for the high priest to come back out. And the high priest, when he went into the Holy of Holies, it wasn't something that he enjoyed and stayed and took his time there. He went in there, he did exactly what he needed to do, and he came right out because he was very afraid to be in the presence of God. And the reason I told you that the rest of the people were holding their breath, they were waiting to see if he was going to come out, because if he came out, that means he was pure enough and holy enough. But if he didn't come out for a long time, that means he dropped dead because he didn't approach God carefully enough. And you're going, what in the world? 50 chapters dedicated to the tabernacle and to the way worship was being done. There were very specific ways in which God was to be approached, signifying his holiness. So do you see the whole difference between how we approach God? Sometimes an argument could be made, and I think there's some really good, valid points there, that we approach God way too casually, not recognizing what a holy God he is and how we're to approach him. But do you see the huge difference in which we're allowed or we're able to approach God and in which they approach God? Because both of the times when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, the rest of the nation stood around holding their breaths, hoping that he would come out. And you know, I told you, you've heard me say this before, that when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, he had a rope tied to his foot. Why? Because if he didn't come out for a long time, they could pull him out of there, because there was no one else in Israel, in the whole nation, that could go in there and retrieve the body if he didn't come out for a very long time. That, my friends, is just a small illustration of just how holy God is and how carefully he is to be approached and how serious of a business it was that the author is describing here in the first 10 verses. And as the author is describing the different parts of the, we talked about the different portions of the tabernacle and the fact that there was a lampstand. Remember, there were no windows in the tabernacle. It was a tent. There was no windows, so the lampstand was to provide some light for the priests as they were doing their jobs. But it also signified the fact that Israel was elected to be the light of the nations. And Christ told us that we are now the light of the world as the church. And then we see the table with the sacred bread, 12 loaves representing one tribe each. And as well as the Holy of Holies. The golden altar of incense, interestingly enough, was what stood right in front of the second curtain. And the priest would grab some coals from that, and they had a fire pan that they would hold in their hands, and they would put the coals from the golden altar of incense into their pan, and they would put incense into that. And you know why? Because they wouldn't dare enter. That incense almost created like a cloud, if you will, of smoke, and they entered holding that. The high priest would enter that into the Holy of Holies, almost as if reminding God of the prayers of his people. And interestingly enough, actually, I didn't realize it until I started kind of preparing for this, but both in the tabernacle and then later in the temple, you know, there was a daily activity going on in the holy place. There was incense that was being burned in the morning and in the evening. And in fact, and we're wondering why in the world would that be a big deal? And I think it's a symbol of the fact that it's a reminder to God, if you will, not a reminder to God, but it's a reminder probably to the people of the fact that because of God's holiness, the way that humans can approach God has to do or must have to do with his prayer, the prayers constantly ascending to God, and God being pleased with the prayers of his people. And so that incense on a daily basis. And in fact, it's interesting kind of how the Bible comes together when you start looking at these kinds of things. But remember in Luke chapter 1, do you remember John's dad? His name is Zechariah. What was he? What was his job? He was a priest, wasn't he? And where did the angel appear to him to tell him that he was going to have a son, and his name was going to be John, and so on and so forth? It was while he was ministering in the temple. And in fact, we learned something interesting through Luke chapter 1 that brings us right back to here and to activity, the activity in Hebrews chapter 9. And what we learn, kind of looking at the rest of the Old Testament, is that the Levites and the priests, they had about 24 different orders that they were divided in. And each order, based on which order they would belong to, had a specific time of year when they would come in to work either the tabernacle or the temple later in Jerusalem. And I don't know if you remember this, but when the Jews finally came into the promised land, Joshua, initially Moses started, but Joshua assigned each of the tribes land, right? The land was divided, and it was assigned to each of the tribes. One tribe did not get any land. You remember what it was? It was the tribe of Levi. Didn't get any land. Why didn't they get any land? Because God was their portion. And so instead of getting land, they were all about serving God, and they had certain cities that were designated as Levitical cities. And so there were 7+ cities around Israel where the Levites, the Levitical tribe and the priests that worked in the temple lived. And so that's how it worked, where when it was their turn, they would travel from that city, wherever they lived, and they would come to Jerusalem and they would work in the temple. And that's where Zechariah was in Luke chapter 1, when the angel met him while doing his duties. So there was constantly something going on. And between the lighting of the menorah, so this lampstand, between the presenting of the incense on the altar, and also sacrifices. Interestingly enough, as we're talking about the Day of Atonement, I pointed this out last week. I want to point it out one more time. And that's at the very end of verse 7. Look at the last word of verse 7. What's that word? Is it ignorance? Ignorance is the last word in my verse, in chapter 9, verse 7. And what that means, the Greek word there that this word is interpreted by is basically errors. So the Day of Atonement was, well, let me back up a little bit. So we're talking about the daily activity of the priest. So what's going on is, in addition to lighting of the lampstand and presenting of the incense twice a day, the other thing that the priests also did, as people committed sins, or they did things that they weren't supposed to, or they made promises to God and so on. A lot of these things in the Old Testament we read about had a sacrifice or an offering to God associated with that. So that was the other thing that the priests did, is they served, they acted, and we've talked about it lots of times before, they were the intermediaries between people and God. And so as people would bring these offerings and these sacrifices, and they would come into the temple, that's what the priests did as well, as they would help people. And so, but the thing about the Day of Atonement, so that backing up to what we just started talking about, is that the normal day-to-day stuff that people committed, the sins that they committed and all those kinds of things, they had sacrifices that they were supposed to offer for those. But as life went on, as we're human, there were things that we did that we may not have realized that we did, or things that we didn't do that we were supposed to do. And it's those errors, if you will. It's those sins committed in ignorance. It's those acts of omission, if you will, that the Day of Atonement was designed to catch all. So once a year, all of those things that were committed without even realizing they were being committed. Once again, the idea is to communicate just how holy God is. That to be in his presence, not only do you have to make sure that you don't commit sins purposefully, willingly, but you also need to make sure that you have absolved yourself, you have covered those sins committed by accident, just because we're humans. That's the whole idea, and that's what the Day of Atonement was for, is to cover for that year the sins of the people committed in ignorance, and that's what that verse is all about. But let's go back before we get completely out of the first 10 verses. A couple of other things that I didn't mention last week, and I just want to make sure that we did. So when he moves into the Holy of Holies, he talks about the contents of the ark itself, and I want to make sure that you guys were clear on that. It says, the Ark of the Covenant, covered on all sides with gold. So we talked about it. It's just a box covered with gold, right? And which was a golden jar holding the manna. Now, we talked about that, and the fact that there was, Moses had made a command. Manna, of course, was how God provided for his people for 40 years. That was the food that was provided for them. It was a daily ration. Every day they went out and they collected some, and on the eve of the Sabbath, so on Friday night, they collected 2 days worth of portion, or the morning, I guess, of Friday. They collected Friday's portion and Sabbath's portion, right? So that they wouldn't have to do that on the Sabbath. But every day, and if anyone was greedy and they tried to collect more than the day's worth, whatever was extra ended up going back. Okay, that's just what happened to him. But that was just God's perfect picture of his provision for his people, just what they needed for when they needed it. And so Moses commanded to take one portion of one man's portion for 1 day and to set it aside as a memory for the people. And that was one of the items that was in the ark. Golden jar holding the manna. And then Aaron's rod which budded. I didn't talk a whole lot about it. And but if you're interested, go to Numbers 16 and 17. It's a really interesting situation there where you had people rebel against Aaron and Moses. Korah was one of the people that rebelled. And they said, "Who made you Lord over us? Why are you leader over us?" And so part of how God dealt with that is God said, I want to show people, all of these people, especially the ones who rebelled, I want to show them who I have chosen. And so they collected from every family, and I think it was just within the Levitical tribe, if you want to know the truth. Kind of sad, really. But they collected a rod, just a stick, basically, if you will. They collected a stick representing every family, and they put it all in one place overnight. The next day they came in, and Aaron's rod, Aaron's stick, and it was just a stick. Imagine this happening overnight. It actually had buds on it, it had leaves on it, and it had full-grown almonds on it. Overnight. Okay? That's in Numbers chapter 17. When was the last time you saw something like that happen overnight? I know I did. I planted some wheat, a few weeks ago, and it's still like about this high or whatever. And it's going to be a while before it actually goes all the way and enough for me, big enough for me to harvest. But this happened overnight. Clearly a miraculous occasion by God for him to tell the rest of the families, this is who I chose. The next thing that God told Aaron and Moses, he said, now step aside. I'm going to wipe them out because of all of their disgusting complaining. And this is one of so many occasions in the Old Testament where we see the true character of Aaron and Moses, where instead of going, you know what, God, you're right, I'm going to wash my hands. Do with these people what they have deserved more than once. Aaron and Moses hit the knees and they pray and they ask God, please, not this time. Please forgive them. But God still dealt with the people that rebelled against. But anyway, the story there is in Numbers 16 and 17. I think you'd really enjoy it if you look over it in more detail at home. But that is what Aaron's rod that budded. That's what that story is all about. And obviously, the other piece of it was the table. So the stone tablets on which God's finger wrote the law, the 10 commandments. That was the other thing that was included in the ark. Now, incidentally, and this is a little bit of a Simon's rabbit trails that you know I'm good at, but I just thought it's a little bit of a history piece that will provide a little bit more context to you, and that is this. So the last time historically that we know the Ark of the Covenant was known to be in the temple, because initially it was in tabernacle, then it was in the temple, was about 587, I think, BC. Around that time, the Babylonians sacked the temple, and the Ark of the Covenant was never seen since then. Now, some of you, maybe a lot of you, have watched Raiders of the Lost Ark, and so you're wondering what part that whole thing plays in this drama of the Ark, and I'm going to tell you very little. But what is interesting is if you just Google, where is the Lost Ark, or where is the Ark of the Covenant? One of the interesting theories that have been there have been for a long time, and I have a good friend that lives in Florida who said he traveled to this place, and the tradition is very strong there, and that is the tradition that the ark eventually made its way to Ethiopia. And there is a church in Ethiopia that is very heavily guarded. The tradition is that that's where the Ark of the Covenant is. There's only one person within that church that is called the guardian of the ark that is allowed to go in there and to take care of it. And I want to tell you something. As a mere mortal, you and I, you're not going to get very close to that room to this day, and so, of course, we don't know if that's where it is, but that's one of the traditions, is that that's where it possibly is. Another theory out there was that the ark was hidden in the hidden passages under the Jerusalem temple. And, of course, that particular theory cannot be tested today because what used to be under the Jerusalem temple is now the site of the Dome of the Rock, which is the third holiest Muslim site in the world. And of course, you ain't getting in there, and you're not going to do any archaeological digging there. So all of that is to say that when the temple was rebuilt, so the first temple that we're talking about, and again, I'm almost getting too close to the end of my little historical rabbit trail, but after the tabernacle, you had David wanting to build the temple. You remember that from the Old Testament. God telling David, that is an awesome desire that you have, but I'd rather your son Solomon, you start collecting the money and start raising the funds, but I'll let your son build it. Solomon built the temple, dedicated it to God, and that's the temple that around 580 or so was destroyed by the Babylonians. The second temple that was built, that was standing at the time of Jesus' ministry around the turn of the era, from BC to AD, was a temple that was built over a long period of time, and it was constructed by Herod partially at the very end. Herod contributed to it. And so that's the second temple, and that's the temple that was destroyed in 70 AD. And so you have no temple, obviously. We talked about that. And there has been, obviously, no sacrifices there. So that's just kind of an interesting historic rabbit trail that has to do with the Ark of the Covenant and the temple. And so then you have, then we're talking here, back to verse 5, just to add something else. And so the other thing that's interesting about the ark is we talked about the contents of the ark, but the lid of the ark was, and it says here, in verse 5, and above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. The lid of the ark was called the mercy seat, or another way for it is, or another name for it is propitiation, the seat of propitiation. Propitiation is kind of a long $5 theological term, if you will, that just means the satisfaction of God's wrath. That's what it means, the satisfaction of God's wrath. And you know, it's really interesting, because if you think about it, the high priest once a year met God, or accessed God's presence, and sprinkled blood, the meeting, if you will, of one representative from the human race with God to place at the mercy seat of God. And then a beautiful picture and a beautiful symbol of, really, if you think about it, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, our access to God has nothing to do with our own accomplishments, with our own works, with our own reaching high enough and doing enough. And that, by the way, is what is the crux of every religion in the world. The central point of every religion in the world, I don't care what they are, is man doing something. It's taking the steps, it's doing the whatever the pillars are, it's accomplishing something, it's trying hard, it's working hard, it's doing everything you can, that maybe with your dying breath, you can finally reach that, whatever that ultimate is, and maybe, just maybe, do enough to please God. But reality is, and that's what makes Christianity so different from any other religion in the world, is that God knows that there's no way that a man can. And therefore, what makes Christianity so different is that all the way from the Old Testament, all the way from the days of the Ark, the understanding was already there. The imagery was already there. The meeting of God with people is not at the end of the long ladder of trying, but it's at the mercy seat of God. Because that's the only place that humans can ever get in touch with God. It's because of his grace. It's by his mercy. And I think it's very, very interesting. And these two cherubim that are described here in verse 5, I'm sure you know this, but just in case, cherubim are angels. That's if you will, a class, a type of angel. The Old Testament and the Bible describes at least two different classes of angels. There, seraphim are one class, and cherubim are another class. And cherubim are known to be protectors or guardian angels, if you will, and that's what this description is here. Again, he doesn't go into a whole lot of detail in verse 5, and brings up in verse 6 the continual nature of that. We talked about it, that it was an ongoing nature, and talked about this, what happens going into the Holy of Holies in verse 7, and we talked about the blood that went in with them. And in verse 8, as he's kind of preparing us for introducing us to the new covenant, the author reminds us that the Holy Spirit is signifying this, that the way to the holy place has not yet been disclosed, while the outer tabernacle is still standing. The idea is this, and this is exactly what I said from the very beginning. Access to God was limited in the Old Testament. In fact, when the Old Testament, let me tell you something, when the Old Testament saints, if you will, when people that were God's people died in the Old Testament, they went to a place called Sheol, which is a temporary holding place, right? And when Christ died, the Bible says that he went into Sheol and he brought people into God's presence with him. And so the access to God was limited in the Old Testament. And it was all through Jesus. The Old Testament didn't have, saints in the Old Testament didn't have different access to God than we do now. Both then and now, the access to God has always been only one, and that is only through Jesus. And that's what the author is telling us here. But he also tells us that, and it's interesting, that the Old Testament sacrifices, and by the way, you can tell by the time that there's no way we're getting through this chapter today. But that's okay. I think I kind of was able to summarize some big ideas, and I think next week we can definitely finish it. But the other thing in verse 9, I think that the author is reminding us here in verse 9, and it's this, that, and it's really kind of interesting if you think about it, that in the Old Testament, and that's what the author told us in chapter 8 already once, but in the Old Testament, the sins of the people were never removed. They were covered. That's what atonement means. You remember me talking about it last week. Atonement means covering. Okay? The sins of the people were covered. The people were ceremonially made clean. They were ceremonially purified. But the ceremonial purity was an outward purity, right? The inside, their conscience, their sense of feeling like you are free of guilt was not removed. You know what this reminds me of? Jesus' indignation when he was here on this earth and he looked at a lot of the Pharisees and people who, and he even called them. He said, you are like whitewashed tombs, didn't he? And I don't know if you know what the story with that is, but during the annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem, it was very important, and I'll kind of close with this story. I may add one more item there, and we'll be done today. But during the annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem, for the worshipers that came all from around the world, wherever they may have lived, because it was Jews, but it was also proselytes. Who are proselytes? They were people, Gentiles, who were converted into Judaism. And so as these people came to Jerusalem for important religious celebrations, one of the things that qualified them to be able to participate in whatever offering or whatever they did in Jerusalem was their ability to be ceremonially clean. When they knew that they were coming to Jerusalem, they couldn't touch a dead body. They couldn't touch a certain thing. And it's all clearly spelled out in the Old Testament. And so in preparation for this annual pilgrimage to Jerusalem, if you will, the people on the path to Jerusalem were responsible with painting tombs and those kinds of things with whitewash, okay, so that they could be easily identified, so that the pilgrims would steer clear and so as to not maybe inadvertently defile themselves. And that's what Jesus called these guys. He said, you're like the whitewashed tombs. Why? Well, because on the outside it's nice and clean. But what are the tombs filled with on the inside? Dead man's bones. And so that's what he said. He said on the outside, you look good, you sound good, you put that plastic smile on to make it look like you're all holy and pure and good and all of that. But he said on the inside, you have all kinds of discord. You have all kinds of sin. You have guilty conscience. You have all these things going on the inside that are just gross. Then if people really saw what you were like on the inside, no one would ever follow you. No one would ever listen to you. And it kind of reminds me of what the first covenant was. And that on the atonement, the atoning, the covering of people's sins never removed them from people's minds. Why? Because to clear the conscience, to remove, to deal with the guilt, there has to be an internal influence. It can't be done from the outside. That's what atonement was. It was external. It was outside. It was covering. It was the blood of the lambs. It was the blood of the bulls. But there had to be an internal influence that cleanses you, that purifies you from the inside. And that's what Hebrews 8 tells us. That's what the difference is with the new covenant, is that in the new covenant, God sends his Spirit who purifies from the inside after Christ's death. That's why the new covenant is so much more superior to the old covenant. And that's what Hebrews 9 tells us about here. Since they relate only to food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until a time of reformation. The only other thing I want to mention to you is, and we'll close with this, and I want to show you one other thing that I think is really, really interesting. Make sure that I point your attention to the right verse here. Okay, Look at verse 13. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling those who have been defiled, sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, how much more? And so he's going to talk about how much more what Jesus does. And I just wanted to make sure that you were clear on something that's really, really interesting here as well. Because in verse 13, you have the blood of goats and bulls, and we talked about, oh, by the way, on the Day of Atonement, one other thing I forgot to tell you is the first time the priest would go in, he would offer a bull for his own sins. He would take the blood, and he would sprinkle it on the mercy seat. He would quickly come out, and people would go, oh, he's still alive. We're good. You know, he did the right things. He purified himself enough. Then he would present a goat offering, go in, the people would go, and he would sprinkle that on the mercy seat, and he would come out, and people would go, oh, good, he's still alive. And so the second time he comes out, then he came out, and there were 2 goats that were chosen for this particular occasion. And by lot, they were chosen which one was going to be sacrificed. And the one that was sacrificed was sacrificed, and the blood was used for the sprinkling. By the way, I told you last week the reason for the whole blood. You were thinking, why is it so bloody? Why is there so much bloodshed in the Old Testament sacrifice? Because blood is the consequence for sin. Okay? Blood is the cost of sin. And so much blood was because there was so much sin. Because from the moment that Adam and Eve sinned, you and I were born in sin. And sin is our second nature. And that's why there was so much blood involved. It was just to remind us that we're sinful and that God is holy. But between the 2 goats that were selected, one by lot was chosen to be sacrificed. The other one was by lot chosen for another reason. And when the high priest came out the second time out of the Holy of Holies, he put his hands on the head of the second goat. And he confessed his sins and the sins of the nation. And he laid them on that goat. And that goat was led outside of the temple, a long ways away, where the goat couldn't find his way back. I mean, outside of the camp, of the Israelite camp, and led a long way in the wilderness where he couldn't find his way back. Why? Because he was a symbol of the removal of the sins from the congregation. The sins that were confessed were placed on the head of this goat, and it was a scapegoat. That's where our scapegoat phrase actually comes from, interestingly enough. And that was the goat that took the sins, literally removed the sins of the people away. That's another beautiful picture of what Christ did. That's another beautiful reminder of the limited nature of the first covenant, because all they could do is just cover the sins, remove the sins, and they had to do that every time, but Christ did it once. But the other thing that I wanted to show you from verse 13, we'll close it here, that I think is really, really interesting, is it talks about the blood of the goats and bulls, and that's the next piece that I don't know how familiar you are with that whole concept, the ashes of a heifer. There is really a really interesting ceremony, basically, in the Old Testament, and the idea is that they were to choose a pure heifer, red heifer, that has no blemish, that has not had yoke on it. And this heifer was to be sacrificed and then burned in its entirety. And the ashes that came from this heifer, they would add a couple more ingredients. They would create a liquid, if you will. They would put some ashes in the water. They would add some hyssop and red wool as well to it. And what that liquid, what it would do is it would have a purifying quality to it. It would be what they would use for purifying items, for purifying things, for purifying priests, and it's just interesting because the ashes of a heifer, they would last a really long time. They could use, the ashes of one heifer could last as long as 200 years for them to be adding a little bit of that heifer. The interesting thing is that in Judaism, the last heifer that was presented was, I think, in AD 63. And there was no more heifer that was presented from that. Now, Samaritans who do not believe that in order to present the heifer, you have to have the temple, they actually had the last heifer that they had presented was in 1300. And the last ashes that were used from that heifer was actually used all the way up to 1600 among the Samaritans. I just think that's an interesting kind of historical piece. The only other thing that I want to comment with that's very interesting, because the Old Testament tells us that when the Messiah comes, the Jewish people today are the ones that are still awaiting Messiah. They're a little confused about his first coming. But what they're awaiting for and preparing for, obviously, we know is the second coming. They still think it's the first coming. But be that as it may, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there have been, as the Jewish people are still preparing in Jerusalem right now, they know, according to the Old Testament, that when the Messiah comes, the temple worship is going to be restored. So for the last, really from the time that Jerusalem once again became a nation, they have initiated the preparation for the temple worship. They have made the instruments and the items, just as they are prescribed in the Old Testament, to be utilized in temple worship. And for the last however many years, you've seen the stories here and there. They have been in search of a red heifer, of a perfect, it had to be a certain specification, red heifer that could actually be presented when the temple is ready to be restored, so that the first thing that's going to need to be done when the temple is rebuilt, that before the sacrifices could take place in the temple, and they know that, is everything is going to have to be purified. And to purify the temple, to get it ready for the sacrifices, you will need a red heifer. And so I've seen some news articles here and there that there has been a search for that perfect red heifer that they could potentially, and the reason they're looking for it, you're like, why are they looking for it? They don't have the temple yet. They don't know when they're going to have the opportunity to rebuild the temple, and they want to, at any given point, be ready to where they have their plan in action and they're ready to go if an opportunity arises, and they have a way to start building the temple. So I just thought it's kind of an interesting historical aside that, again, gives a little bit of a context to what we're studying here. As always, we'll close in prayer this morning, but as always, the point of what we're trying to do here is to show you that really this is not just some obscure book in the middle or at the end of New Testament that was written 2,000 years ago, and there's absolutely no connection to our day and life, because God's word is living and breathing. It's a living word of God, and it's active, as we learn here in Hebrews, also in chapter 4. Because of that, it has power and it has application, and it very much applies to what we're doing today. Because again, that's the difference between this book and any other book in the world out there. It's not only is it active and living and breathing, but it also has the ability, you can read the same verse today, and you can read 10 years later or 5 years later, and it will communicate to you on a totally different level, because it's communicating to you not something entirely different, but because it's communicating to you based on where you are spiritually and based on your spiritual maturity. And as you grow, you see things that you've never seen before. That's the beauty of God's word. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your holy word that you have given to us. Thank you for these ancient words that may have been penned 2,000 years ago, and they may have referred or used the symbolism that was used even before then, and yet we can read them today, and we can dig into them, and we can uncover them, and we can see how much they apply to our situation in 2021. And so I pray that you would encourage us. I pray that as we access your presence this week, you would remind us of the beauty of the new covenant under which we live, and the freedom we have to worship you, the freedom we have to come straight into your presence, the freedom that was not enjoyed in the old covenant. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.